In April 2008, the United States Air Force held a retirement ceremony for an aircraft. Speeches, a final flypast, the jets flew out to a base in the Nevada desert and crews began taking the wings off them. That aircraft was the F-117 Nighthawk, the first operational stealth aircraft anyone had ever built. Officially, that was the end of it. 18 years later, it is still flying, not in a museum, not at an airshow, flying over Nevada, refueling from tankers that did not exist when it retired, and turning up in exercises alongside frontline fighters. And the Air Force has arranged support to keep it doing exactly that until at least 2034. An aircraft that was officially dead in 2008 now has a scheduled flying career running into the 2030s. There is a reason for it. It has nothing to do with nostalgia and nothing to do with combat. Start with what actually happened in 2008 because the details matter later. Lockheed Skunk Works built 64 of these aircraft in total, 5 development airframes and 59 production jets. The first flew in 1981. The type entered service in October 1983, and for its first several years, the Air Force denied it existed at all. It went to war over Panama in 1989, then Iraq in 1991, where a small force of Nighthawks struck well over 1,000 high-value targets. Command bunkers, communications nodes, the things everything else needed destroyed before it could operate safely. One was shot down over Serbia in 1999, which remains the only combat loss of the type. Then, in 2008, the Air Force retired it. The stated reasoning was straightforward. Newer stealth aircraft were arriving with broader capability, and money was tight. The Nighthawk was pulled early, and a significant part of that argument was that retiring it freed funding for the F-22. Here is the part that usually gets skipped. The aircraft were not scrapped. They were flown to the Tonopah Test Range in Nevada, the same remote airfield they had operated from in secret in the 1980s, and put into a particular kind of storage. Wings removed, systems preserved, sealed hangars. That is not disposal. That is a category of storage specifically intended to allow an aircraft to be brought back. The Air Force retired the F-117 and then spent money keeping it capable of returning. For years, that looked like bureaucratic caution, an expensive habit nobody had got around to canceling. It was not. Because a handful of those aircraft never actually stopped flying. And the reason why is one of the more genuinely interesting things in modern military aviation. To understand why it is still useful, you have to understand what it actually was. And almost everything the name suggests about it is wrong. Start with the designation, F-117. The F stands for fighter. It was not a fighter. It carried no air-to-air missiles. It had no radar at all. Not a limited radar, none. Because a radar transmits, and transmitting defeats the entire point of the aircraft. It was a subsonic, single-seat precision bomber carrying 2 laser-guided bombs in an internal bay and nothing else. The fighter designation appears to have been chosen, in part, to attract experienced fighter pilots into a program they could not be told anything about. Now the shape. Everyone remembers the faceting, that angular origami look, all flat panels and hard edges, like something folded out of black paper. That shape is not a style choice. It is a snapshot of what computers could do in the 1970s. Radar cross-section can be calculated. The mathematics existed. What did not exist was the processing power to model how radar energy scatters off a curved surface. Flat panels, though, a computer of that era could handle. So the engineers built an entire aircraft out of flat panels, each one angled to bounce radar energy away from the transmitter instead of back at it. The result flew badly enough that it needed constant computer correction just to stay in the air, and the nickname it earned inside the program reflected that precisely. But it worked. The returns it produced were smaller than anything else in the sky. Everything else about the aircraft was subordinated to that one requirement. The engine exhausts were flattened into wide slots and shielded to spread the heat before it left the airframe. The cockpit glass was coated in a gold-tinted film because a pilot's helmet inside an uncoated canopy reflects radar energy beautifully. Even the smallest openings on the surface had serrated edges, because a straight seam scatters energy in a way a sawtooth one does not. Then look at what came after, because the story is written on the airframes. The B-2 is smooth, the F-22 is smooth, the F-35 is smooth. The curves arrived the moment computers got good enough to calculate them. The F-117 is the only operational aircraft that shows you the limits of 1970s computing in its literal shape. So the fleet went to Tonopah in 2008. And then, over the following years, people started photographing them in the air. Not officially announced, not denied either. Aircraft spotters with long lenses, parked on public land outside the Nevada ranges, kept catching black faceted shapes doing things retired aircraft do not do. By 2020, it had stopped being ambiguous. Nighthawks appeared in exercises operating alongside dedicated aggressor squadrons at Nellis Air Force Base. They turned up on the West Coast working with Marine and Navy units out of Miramar. They were not sneaking around, they were participating. Then came the detail that makes the point better than any of it. In 2025, an F-117 was photographed taking fuel from a KC-46 tanker, reported as the first time it had been seen doing so. Think about that sequence. An aircraft retired in 2008 was given the ability to refuel from a tanker that did not enter Air Force service until years after that retirement. Somebody spent money integrating a supposedly dead aircraft with equipment that arrived after its own funeral. That is not preservation. That is investment. And it is not a small side activity. The Air Force has arranged sustainment support for these aircraft running through at least 2034, 26 years after the retirement ceremony. If you want the engineering behind the aircraft actually flying these missions, rather than the version in the press release, subscribe. That's what this channel does. Because the obvious question at this point is the interesting one. The F-117 is subsonic. It has no radar and no air-to-air capability. Its stealth is 30-year-old technology that the aircraft which replaced it comfortably exceed. What job could it possibly be doing that an F-22 or an F-35 could not do better? The answer is that it is doing the opposite job. Here is the problem nobody outside the community talks about. Stealth is not a wall. It does not make an aircraft invisible. It makes it small on a radar screen, and it makes it late. It shrinks the distance at which you can detect something and the time you have to react once you do. Which means defeating stealth is not about inventing a magic radar. It is about training people and refining sensors to work with a very small signal that appears very briefly. And you cannot train against something you do not have. If you are a radar operator or a fighter pilot or an air defense crew on a warship, and your job is to find a low observable aircraft, then you need a low observable aircraft to fly against you. Repeatedly. Predictably. Under controlled conditions where the results can be measured and compared. So who provides it? Not the F-22. There are 187 of them. They are the most closely guarded aircraft in the inventory. They cost an enormous amount per flight hour, and every one of them is already committed. The same logic applies to the F-35 and to the B-2 more strongly still. Using frontline stealth aircraft as training targets means burning irreplaceable airframe hours on the most expensive machines you own in order to pretend to be the enemy. And the usual solution does not work here. Adversary training normally runs on cheap conventional jets, aircraft flown to imitate an opponent's tactics rather than its physics. That works fine when the thing you are practicing against is a maneuver. It fails completely when the thing you are practicing against is a radar return. You cannot simulate a small signature with an aircraft that has a large one. Either the returns are real or the training is theater. The F-117 solves that. It is already built, it is already paid for. Its radar signature has been measured more thoroughly than that of almost any aircraft in history, which means when a sensor detects it, you know precisely what was detected and why. It is stealthy enough to be a genuine problem for a crew trying to find it, and, critically, it is not so stealthy that flying it around reveals anything about what current frontline aircraft look like on a screen. That last point is the one that matters most. A training adversary that exposed the true characteristics of the F-22 would be a security problem in itself. One that sits a full generation behind is safe to fly openly and still genuinely hard to catch. So the aircraft's value quietly inverted. For 25 years, it was valuable for what it could attack. For the 18 years since, it has been valuable for what it can be attacked by. It stopped being a weapon and became a measuring instrument. And that is a role with no natural replacement, because every candidate for it is either a frontline asset you cannot spare or a new aircraft you would have to build and then characterize from scratch. Adversary flying is one half of it. The other half is testing. Every counter-stealth idea, a new radar, an infrared search and track system, a processing algorithm, a sensor fusion technique, arrives at the same requirement at some point in its development. Somebody has to point it at something stealthy and find out whether it actually works. The same is true in reverse. New radar-absorbent coatings, new signature reduction techniques, new heat management ideas all need an airframe to be applied to and flown. Preferably one where nothing catastrophic happens to a major program if a test goes badly. The F-117 fits that description precisely. It is a stealth aircraft with no operational commitments, no deployment schedule, and no combat role to protect. There is nothing it is late for. Reporting over the past several years has described the surviving aircraft being used to validate sensors, infrared tracking, coatings, and counter-stealth tactics at a fraction of the cost and risk of tying up a frontline jet. There is a reason this cannot all be done on the ground. A stealth aircraft can be measured very precisely on a pole at a test range, and that is where the numbers come from. But a pole does not move, does not maneuver, does not bank into a turn and expose a surface the designers never intended a radar to see, and does not fly through weather. The gap between what an airframe measures at rest and what it looks like at 400 knots is exactly the gap the training is meant to close. And there is an irony in it worth sitting with for a second. The aircraft that opened the stealth age in 1983, the one every subsequent low observable design learned from, now spends its time being hunted by the aircraft that replaced it, so those aircraft can learn how to find something they cannot see. It taught the world how to hide, now it teaches the world how to look. The pilots flying against it were, in many cases, not born when it entered service. The jets they are flying exist because of what this aircraft proved. None of it was planned in 2008. There was no memo describing a second career. What happened is that somebody chose preservation over the shredder, and then a requirement appeared that only a preserved aircraft could fill. Which brings us to the part that has not been resolved. Because the Air Force is doing two opposite things to this fleet at the same time. In 2016, the policy changed. The aircraft would no longer be held in reactivatable storage indefinitely. They would be demilitarized and disposed of at a steady rate. The figures reported have ranged from around 4 a year down to 2 or 3. Some would go to museums, the rest would be scrapped. That process has been running ever since, and you can watch the numbers move. Of the 64 aircraft built, 6 were lost over the years. 13 went to museums and display. In 2023, an Air Force spokesperson put the remaining inventory at approximately 45, describing them as aircraft being demilitarized, made available to museums if requested, or otherwise disposed of. Roughly 10 of those are currently earmarked for museum duty. Only a small number, reporting suggests around 5, appear to be actively flying. So one side of the building is destroying the fleet on a schedule. The other side of the building has arranged to keep flying it until at least 2034. Both of those statements are true right now. The fleet shrinks every year, the mission keeps getting extended, and nothing in the public record explains what happens when those two lines meet. When the disposal schedule reaches the last airworthy aircraft, while the sustainment arrangement still has years left to run. That contradiction has not been resolved anywhere. It has simply been allowed to continue. If breakdowns like this are what you came here for, the part where the official story and the arithmetic disagree, hit like. It's the clearest signal that puts this in front of people who want the same thing. Because there is one more question underneath all of it. If the job is this useful, why not simply build something to do it? The obvious answer is a purpose-built stealth adversary. An unmanned aircraft designed from the start to play the enemy, cheap enough to fly constantly, with a signature tailored to whatever needs practicing against. That idea is not new, and work in that direction exists. But look at what the F-117 offers that a new-build aircraft cannot, and the delay starts to make sense. It is already there. The airframes exist. The maintenance knowledge exists. The infrastructure at Tonopah exists. And the aircraft's signature has been characterized across 4 decades of measurement, which means when a sensor picks it up, there is a very deep body of data explaining exactly what was picked up. A new aircraft has none of that on day one. You would have to build it, then measure it exhaustively, then build confidence in the results. That is years of work and a program budget to replace something the Air Force already owns and could fly tomorrow. This is the same lesson that turns up everywhere in aviation procurement, and it is worth stating plainly. What you already have is frequently worth more than what you can order. The Air Force learned that the hard way with the F-22 production line, which it closed and then discovered it could not realistically reopen. A study delivered to Congress in 2017 put the cost of restarting it and building 194 more aircraft at over $50 billion, with nearly $10 billion of that spent before a single new jet existed. Nobody made a decision to keep the F-117 flying for a quarter of a century. Somebody made a decision not to destroy it immediately. Those are different things, and the second one turned out to be worth far more than anyone intended. So the F-117 Nighthawk did not come back. That is the thing most retellings of this get wrong. It never left. An aircraft was retired in 2008 for budget reasons, put into storage that preserved it rather than ended it, and then quietly found a job nothing else in the inventory could do. Flying as the enemy, so that the aircraft which replaced it could learn to find something they cannot see. It is subsonic. It has no radar. Its stealth is a generation behind everything it flies against. And none of that matters because its value stopped being about what it could destroy and became about what it could teach. Somewhere in Nevada, roughly 5 aircraft that officially do not fly anymore are taking off, and a disposal schedule is slowly moving toward them. The Air Force has not said which of those two things stops first.